My husband said out loud why he married me during foreplay. I turned that truth into his ruin. The bedroom was quiet, lit only by the soft glow of a bedside lamp. Julian leaned in close, his breath warm against my neck. We were in the middle of a moment that should have been private and loving. I felt safe, or at least I thought I did. Then, his voice dropped into a low, careless whisper that chilled my blood. "You know I only married you for your connections, right?" he said. He chuckled softly, as if he had just told a funny joke. I froze instantly. The air in the room felt thick and hard to breathe. I pulled back just enough to see his face. He was still grinning, looking smug and satisfied with himself. He didn't realize that the world I had built for him was cracking right down the middle. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stared into his eyes, looking for a sign that he was kidding. There was none. Before we continue this journey of justice, please subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what time it is where you are. I whispered, "Say that again." He just laughed louder, thinking I was playing a game. Julian fell asleep a few minutes later. I could hear his steady, deep breathing, the sound of a man who didn't have a single care in the world. He was satisfied, while I lay there perfectly still, staring at the white ceiling. The darkness of the room felt like it was pressing down on me. I replayed his words over and over in my head. Every "I love you," every romantic dinner, and every sweet promise now felt like a business transaction. I wasn't his wife. I was a ladder he had used to climb to the top. Just as I felt a tear sting my eye, his phone on the nightstand vibrated. The screen lit up the dark room. It was a text message from a contact labeled, "Investor call tomorrow." I recognized the name immediately. It was one of my father's oldest business partners. Julian wasn't just using my name. He was already moving in on my family's deepest secrets while I slept right next to him. I realized then that our entire marriage was a lie. I got out of bed quietly and walked into the bathroom. I shut the door and leaned against the cold sink. I looked at myself in the mirror, hardly recognizing the woman staring back. My name is Patricia, and I am the daughter of a man who spent his life helping others. I repeated Julian's line under my breath. "For your connections." At first, the words burned like acid in my throat. I felt small and foolish. But then, the heat turned into something else. It cooled into a sharp, icy focus. I wasn't going to cry anymore. I was going to think. I walked over to my vanity and opened my laptop. My hands were steady now. I pulled up our digital files and found our marriage contract. I began to read every single line, looking for the tiny details I had ignored when I was blinded by what I thought was love. I needed to see exactly how much of me he thought he owned. The legal language was cold, but my heart was becoming even colder. As I read the papers, I thought about who I really was. I wasn't just Julian's wife. I was the daughter of a powerful philanthropist. My father's name opened doors all over the country. His money and his influence were the very things that had built Julian's business empire from the ground up. Without my family, Julian would be nothing more than a man with a nice suit and an empty bank account. He had used my father's reputation to get loans and my mother's social circles to find investors. I remembered a conversation I had with my father right before the wedding. He had pulled me aside, looking worried. He told me, "Patricia, be careful. A man like Julian needs you more than he loves you." At the time, I thought my father was just being overprotective. I thought he didn't understand our special bond. Now, sitting in the dark, I realized my father had seen the truth from the very beginning. I had been a trophy and a tool, and nothing more. I sat on the floor and let my mind wander back to when we first met. I remembered our courtship and how perfect it seemed. Julian had proposed so quickly after meeting my parents for the first time. I thought it was passion, but now I saw it was a strategy. He had learned the schedule of my family's foundation by heart. He knew exactly which events to attend and which people to impress. He had spent months studying my life like a student prepares for a big test. Every flowers on a Tuesday moment and every spontaneous trip was planned to make me trust him. He hadn't fallen in love with my personality or my dreams. He had looked at my life and seen a gold mine. I whispered to the empty room. He didn't marry me, he acquired me. It was like he had bought a company instead of starting a family. The realization was painful, but it gave me a goal. If Julian wanted to treat our marriage like a business, I was going to show him exactly how I handled bad business partners. The sun began to peek through the curtains, but I didn't feel tired. I felt a strange, quiet energy. I realized that reacting with a loud scream or a messy fight would only give Julian time to prepare. He expected me to be the emotional, obedient Patricia he had spent years molding. Instead, I decided to dismantle him the way he had built his fortune, quietly, piece by piece, and without any warning. I needed to move in the shadows. My first step was to secure my family's interests before he could do any more damage. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in a long time. It was my father's most trusted legal advisor, a man who had known me since I was a child. When he answered, my voice didn't shake. I told him I needed a private meeting immediately. I told him I needed to understand everything about trust dissolutions and how to pull back a husband's access to family wealth. The war had officially started. I spent the next few hours in my study, going through every digital bank statement I could find. Since Julian handled the finances to save me the trouble, I hadn't looked closely at the accounts in months. My stomach turned as I discovered a horrific paper trail. Julian had been siphoning money from my family foundation's charity accounts and moving it into his own personal ventures. This wasn't just greed, it was a betrayal of every person the foundation helped. As I clicked through the transfer history, I saw something even worse. Every single signature on the transfer documents was mine, but I had never signed them. He had forged my name over and over again to make it look like I was the one moving the money. He was setting me up to take the fall if he ever got caught. He was using me as a human shield for his crimes. I felt a cold chill wash over me as I realized how deep his villainy truly went. By the time Julian woke up, I had cleared the browser history and was sitting at the breakfast table with a fresh pot of coffee. He walked in, wearing his expensive silk robe, looking cheerful and refreshed. He leaned over and kissed my cheek, and it took every ounce of my strength not to recoil in disgust. "You look lovely this morning, Patricia," he said, reaching for the newspaper. He started talking about a new deal he was closing, telling me how much he appreciated my obedient nature. He said it made his life so much easier when he didn't have to explain the boring business details to me. I smiled sweetly at him, playing the part of the perfect, simple wife. "I just want you to be successful, honey," I replied. While he was distracted by his breakfast, I reached into his leather briefcase and slid a forged document of my own into his folder. It was a fake authorization form that would lead him straight into a trap I was setting. Later that morning, I drove to a quiet park to meet a young lawyer named Marcus. Marcus's father had once been saved from a terrible legal battle by my father, and Marcus had always said he owed our family a debt of gratitude. He was young, hungry, and incredibly smart. We sat on a park bench, and I handed him the files I had gathered. Together, we began cataloging every instance of Julian's fraud. Marcus's eyes grew wide as he saw the forged signatures and the stolen charity funds. He told me that Julian hadn't just been greedy, he had been sloppy because he thought I would never look. "He's buried himself, Patricia," Marcus said with a grim grin. "He thinks he's a genius, but he left a trail a mile wide. We just have to shine the light on it at the right moment." I felt a surge of hope. For the first time, I wasn't just a victim. I was the one holding the flashlight. A few days later, we attended a grand charity gala. The room was filled with the most powerful people in the city. Julian was in his element, wearing a tuxedo that my money had bought, bragging to everyone about his upcoming $200 million merger. He held my hand tightly, using me as a prop to show how connected he was. "I couldn't have done it without my lovely wife," he told a group of reporters, prompting a round of polite applause. I stood there, smiling for the cameras, feeling the weight of his lie. He thought this merger was the crowning achievement of his career. He thought it would make him untouchable. What he didn't know is that I had already spent the last 48 hours making sure that merger would never, ever happen. Before we reach the climax of his ruin, please hit subscribe for more true revenge stories. I looked at Julian's smug face and knew his world was about to end. Standing in that ballroom, I felt like I was waking up from a long, deep sleep. For years, I had let Julian dim my light so he could shine brighter. I had forgotten the woman I was before I met him. I used to be creative, bold, and completely fearless. I was the girl who traveled the world alone and started her own art programs. Julian had convinced me that I was fragile and needed his protection, but that was just another part of his long con. He wanted me small so he could stay big. That night, after the gala, I sat in the dark and looked at my old life. I went to my laptop and pulled up my dormant social media profiles. I hadn't posted anything that wasn't brand approved by Julian in 3 years. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I deleted his name from my bio and updated my status with just one simple word: back. It felt like a declaration of war. I wasn't just his connection anymore. I was Patricia, and I was taking my soul back. The next afternoon, I arranged a secret meeting with Mr. Sterling, the CEO of the rival company Julian was trying to merge with. We met in a private back room of a quiet library, far away from the prying eyes of the city's socialites. Mr. Sterling was a serious man who valued honesty above everything else. I didn't waste any time with small talk. I opened my bag and handed him a folder filled with the documents Marcus and I had prepared. I showed him the proof of Julian's fraud, the stolen charity funds, and the forged signatures. Mr. Sterling's face turned a deep shade of red as he read the truth. He realized that Julian was planning to use the merger to hide his crimes and steal even more money. "This is disgusting," Sterling whispered, looking at me with newfound respect. "We will make this right, Patricia. I'm pulling out of the deal, and I will make sure you own what's yours again." I thanked him and left, feeling the first real victory in my chest. When I got home that evening, Julian was waiting for me in the living room with 2 glasses of expensive wine. He seemed strangely soft and attentive. He sat close to me, whispering that he had been thinking about our future. He said he wanted to start a family and have a baby. He called it our legacy and the missing piece of our empire. A few months ago, I would have cried with joy at those words. I would have thought he finally loved me for who I was. But now I could see right through the mask. He didn't want a child to love. He wanted an asset. He knew that a baby would tie me to him forever and make it almost impossible for my father to cut him off. A child was just another connection to him, a way to secure his grip on the family fortune. I looked at him and felt a wave of nausea. I realized he was willing to use a human life just to keep his bank account full. I knew I had to move faster. The next morning, I went to a bank across town where Julian had no influence. I opened a completely separate bank account in my name only. I worked with my father's accountant to begin routing every new donation, every sponsorship, and every personal dividend into this new, secret account. For years, Julian had funneled my income into joint accounts that he controlled. I was finally cutting the cord. I also contacted the foundation's lawyers to update the sponsorship agreements. From now on, any check written to the Patricia Woods Foundation had to be signed by me alone. Julian was so busy bragging to his friends about his perfect life and his obedient wife that he didn't notice the money was drying up. He was still spending like a king, completely unaware that the floor was being pulled out from under his feet. He was too busy showing off his fake power to notice that his real power was already gone. While Julian was at a business lunch, I decided to check his private office one last time. I found his old laptop hidden in a drawer and managed to guess his password. It was the date he proposed to me. I thought it was sentimental, but it was probably just a date he saw as his opening day. I went through his email chain and found a message he had sent to his secret partners. My heart stopped as I read his words. He told them I was useful as long as she behaves, and that I was too stupid to notice the missing millions. He joked about how easy it was to manipulate a woman who just wanted to be loved. I felt a hot flash of anger, but I didn't let it consume me. I took my phone, photographed every single email, and printed them out. I walked out of that office and slid the papers into my lawyer's folder. Julian had provided the final nail for his own coffin. The evidence was finally heavy enough to crush him. I met Marcus at his office, and we went over the final strategy. We decided it was time to move from defense to offense. Marcus picked up the phone and filed a confidential inquiry with the state authorities regarding Julian's shell corporations. We provided the account numbers, the forged documents, and the email chains I had recovered from his laptop. Within hours, the legal wheels began to turn. The investigators were stunned by the sheer scale of the theft. They discovered millions of dollars that had vanished into thin air, hidden behind layers of fake company names. Julian thought he was a master of disguise, but he had left a trail of digital breadcrumbs that led straight to our front door. As Marcus scrolled through the findings, he looked at me with a steady gaze. "There's no turning back now, Patricia. Once they start digging, they won't stop until they find everything." I nodded slowly, feeling a cold sense of relief. The trap was set. For the next few days, Julian seemed completely oblivious to the storm gathering above his head. He came home every night smelling of expensive bourbon, talking about how unstoppable we were. He paced the living room, waving his hands, as he described the luxury yacht he planned to buy once the merger was finalized. He looked at me with that same smug grin, the one that used to make me feel safe but now made me feel sick. "We're going to be the most powerful couple in this city, Patricia," he boasted, pouring himself another drink. I sat on the sofa, stitching a piece of embroidery, looking like the picture of a calm, supportive wife. I looked up at him and forced a small, thin smile. "That depends on how you define we, Julian," I replied softly. He just chuckled, thinking I was making a sweet comment about our bond. He had no idea that my we no longer included him at all. I decided to set the final stage for his public downfall. I suggested to Julian that we host a small, intimate dinner with my parents at our favorite upscale restaurant. I told him it was time to show my father how much we had grown as a couple. Then I dropped the bait. "I think we should announce a renewal of our vows," I whispered, touching his arm. "It would show the board of directors that our foundation is built on a solid, loving family." Julian's eyes lit up with greed. He knew a vow renewal would look great in the press and secure his standing with my father's wealthy friends. He agreed eagerly, even suggesting we invite a few key reporters to capture the moment. I smiled and told him I would handle all the arrangements. He was so excited about the publicity that he didn't realize I had scheduled the dinner for the exact same day the state was launching their official audit. The night of the dinner arrived. Julian spent the afternoon at his tailor, making sure his suit was perfect for the cameras. He was at the restaurant early, sitting at our reserved table and rehearsing the grand speech he planned to give to my parents. He wanted to sound humble yet powerful, the perfect son-in-law. Meanwhile, across town, a team of authorities and forensic accountants arrived at his office with a warrant. They began raiding his files and seizing his computers. While he was checking his reflection in the restaurant's silver spoons, his secretary began calling him frantically. His phone buzzed over and over again on the table, vibrating against the white linen cloth. Julian looked at the caller ID, frowned, and silhouetted the device. "Not now," he muttered to himself, thinking it was just a minor work issue. He wanted nothing to interrupt his big moment of triumph. He had no clue that his entire empire was being loaded into boxes. I arrived at the restaurant a few minutes late, wearing a stunning red dress that breathed confidence. My parents were already there, looking at Julian with forced politeness. Julian stood up, looking pale and slightly anxious because the calls wouldn't stop, but he tried to maintain his cool. He reached for my hand to begin his speech, but before he could say a single word, the heavy glass doors of the restaurant swung open. A swarm of reporters and photographers rushed in, their flashes blinding everyone in the room. Julian's face went from pale to ghostly white as he saw the cameras. He thought they were there for our vow renewal, but then he saw the headlines on their tablets. Charity CEO investigated for massive fraud. The room went silent as the world saw him for who he truly was. Before we see his final confession, hit subscribe for more true revenge stories. I stepped back, letting the light hit his terrified face. The restaurant was a sea of flashing lights and shouted questions. Julian stood frozen, his mouth hanging open like a fish out of water. He looked at my parents, then at the reporters, searching for a way to spin the disaster. When the police officers stepped through the crowd to hand him a formal summons, he finally broke. He grabbed my arm and dragged me toward a quiet hallway behind the kitchen. His face was twisted with a mixture of fear and pure, unadulterated rage. "What did you do?" he hissed, his fingers digging into my skin. "You did this, didn't you? You told them." I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back up into his desperate eyes. I didn't feel afraid of him anymore. I felt a strange sense of pity for how small he had become. I pulled my arm away with a slow, deliberate strength. "I finally did exactly what you wanted, Julian," I answered calmly. "I believed you. You told me you only married me for my connections. So, I decided it was time you met them." The fallout was swifter than a summer storm. By the next morning, the board of directors held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to suspend Julian indefinitely. They didn't even give him time to pack his personal belongings. His name was stripped from the building's glass entrance before noon. Every news channel in the city was running segments on the charity thief who had betrayed the city's most beloved foundation. While the investigators dug through his shell companies, his personal bank accounts were frozen by court order. He had no access to the millions he had stolen or the family money he had grown used to spending. Meanwhile, the foundation's legal team worked around the clock to declare our charity's innocence. Because I had documented his forgeries and his secret transfers, the foundation was cleared of any wrongdoing. I was hailed as the brave whistleblower who had saved the organization from a predator. Julian was left with nothing but his expensive suits and a pile of legal bills he couldn't pay. With his accounts frozen and his reputation in tatters, Julian had no choice but to move out of our estate. He packed a single suitcase and moved into a cheap hotel on the outskirts of town, a place far below the elite standards he used to brag about. As soon as his car pulled out of the driveway, I called a locksmith. I changed every lock on every door, updated the security codes, and hired a private firm to patrol the grounds. I wanted the air he breathed to be completely removed from my home. That night, the house felt larger and quieter than it had in years. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from Julian. "You're making a mistake, Patricia," it read. "You're weak. You can't live without me to handle the world for you. You'll crawl back in a week." I stared at the message, remembering how those words used to make me doubt myself. Now, they just felt like the desperate cries of a drowning man. I didn't let his message sit in my inbox for more than a second. I didn't need to write a long paragraph or explain my feelings. I simply typed 2 words. "Watch me." I hit send and blocked his number immediately. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, feeling a surge of energy I hadn't felt since my childhood. I went straight to the foundation's headquarters. The staff looked at me with a mix of surprise and hope. I walked into the main hall and announced that we were starting a new chapter of transparency and growth. Within 48 hours, the foundation's value doubled in public goodwill. People who had been afraid to donate because of Julian's reputation were now sending checks to support my new vision. The community rallied behind me, proving that the connections Julian loved so much were actually tied to my character, not just my last name. He thought I was the anchor dragging him down, but he was actually the weight I had finally cut loose. The revenge was no longer a plan. It was a living, breathing reality. I decided it was time to step into the spotlight myself. I scheduled a major press conference on the steps of the foundation. I wore a professional Navy suit and stood tall before dozens of microphones. I didn't talk about Julian as a husband, I talked about him as a lesson in ethics. I unveiled a series of new programs designed to ensure total transparency and protect our donors' money. I spoke about the importance of integrity and how we would rebuild everything he had tried to destroy. The public sided with me completely. I wasn't just the wife anymore, I was a leader. I watched the live feed on a monitor and saw the comments pouring in. For the first time, people were seeing Patricia, the visionary, not Patricia, the connection. Julian sat in his dark hotel room, watching me become the very power he had tried to steal. This was the moment the world shifted. While the public celebrated my new leadership, the legal walls were closing in on Julian. I met with the district attorney and provided a final, organized binder of evidence. It contained every forged signature, every hidden offshore account, and every email where he bragged about his deceit. I watched as the investigators' faces hardened. They had found the smoking gun. Julian hadn't just been moving money to his business. He had been funneling millions into offshore charities that existed only on paper. These were shell organizations he used to launder money for his own personal gain. By the time I left the courthouse, the authorities were already drafting the official warrants. The evidence showed a systematic plan to bleed the foundation dry while using my father's reputation as a shield. I felt a sense of heavy peace. I had done my part. I had handed the truth over to the people who could finally make him answer for it. My role as his protector was over. My role as his judge had begun. A few days later, the moment the city had been waiting for finally arrived. Julian had agreed to a live television interview from his hotel, hoping he could still manipulate the public with his charm. He sat there, looking tired but trying to appear like a victim of a terrible misunderstanding. However, the interview was cut short when authorities arrived with handcuffs. The cameras caught everything. They caught the look of pure terror on Julian's face as he was read his rights. They caught him being led out of the building in a suit that now looked too big for him. At that exact same moment, I was walking down the hallway of the courthouse for a separate meeting. The cameras caught me, too. I walked past him with my head held high, looking calm and untouched by his chaos. I didn't stop to look at him. I didn't offer a single word of comfort. I simply kept walking toward my own bright future, leaving him behind in the dust of his own making. Julian's legal team realized they were in a hopeless position. Within 48 hours, his lawyers reached out to Marcus, begging for a private meeting to discuss a settlement. They offered to return a portion of the stolen funds if I would agree to sign a statement saying I had misinterpreted some of the documents. They wanted to save his reputation and keep him out of a long prison sentence. Marcus called me and put the phone on speaker. I sat in my father's old leather chair and listened to them grovel. They talked about his contributions and how a public trial would be bad for the family name. When they finally stopped talking, I leaned into the phone. My voice was as cold as a winter morning. "You wanted my connections, Julian," I said, knowing he was listening in the background. "Now you can meet them in a court of law. There will be no settlement. We will see you at the trial." I hung up and felt a surge of pure power. The trial was the biggest event the city had seen in decades. The courtroom was packed every single day with reporters, former friends, and the people Julian had defrauded. I sat in the front row, watching as the prosecution played the evidence Marcus and I had gathered. They played recordings of his bragging and showed his fake ledgers on a giant screen. But the most powerful moment came when they played the audio from his own laptop. His voice filled the room, cold and mocking, as he spoke to his partners. "I only married her for her connections," his voice echoed through the speakers. I watched the jury's faces. Many of them gasped in horror. They saw a man who had no soul, a man who viewed love as a weapon for profit. Julian sat at the defense table, staring at his hands, unable to look at anyone. His own words were being used to tear down the very walls he had built to protect himself. The jury did not need much time to deliberate. When they returned to the courtroom, the silence was so heavy you could hear a pin drop. Julian stood up, his legs shaking visibly. The foreperson read the verdict. Guilty. He was found guilty on all counts of fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft. The judge was not lenient. She spoke about the betrayal of public trust and the cruelty of his actions toward his own family. She ordered that all of his assets be seized to pay back the people he had hurt. Because of the way I had structured the foundation and the pre-marriage documents, I kept the estate and the foundation entirely. Julian was sentenced to a long term in a high-security prison. As he was led away in chains, he looked over his shoulder at me one last time. I didn't look back with anger. I looked back with the calm satisfaction of a woman who had finally balanced the books. Justice had been served. After the final gavel fell, the world wanted a piece of me. My phone rang for 3 days straight with requests from news stations and magazines. Everyone wanted to know how I felt, but I stayed quiet. I needed time to breathe. Finally, I agreed to sit down with one respected journalist who had followed the foundation for years. We sat in my garden, far away from the noise of the city. She asked me many questions about the trial and the money, but then she leaned in closer. "What did that night feel like, Patricia?" she asked softly. "The night he told you the truth?" I looked out at the flowers my mother had planted and felt a chill. It felt like hearing an empire collapse between heartbeats. I told her. I explained that the sound of his voice wasn't just a betrayal. It was the sound of a wall falling down. It was painful, but it was the only way I could finally see the sun. The interview went viral, but for the first time, I didn't care about the numbers. With Julian gone, I poured all my energy into rebuilding. I didn't just want the foundation to be okay. I wanted it to be better than ever. I transformed it into a global platform that supported women entrepreneurs who had been held back by people like Julian. I used my family's connections to create a network of mentors and advisors. We funded thousands of small businesses, and I spent my days traveling to see the lives we were changing. My father's name was once again a symbol of hope rather than a tool for greed. Invitations to parties and high society galas flooded my mailbox every morning. People who had once ignored me were now desperate for my attention. But I had learned my lesson about the elite. I accepted none of the invitations. I prefer to spend my evenings at home or with the real people I was helping. My life was finally full, and it didn't require a tuxedo or a fake smile to feel valuable. One evening, a famous publisher reached out to me with a massive offer. They wanted me to write my story. They told me that people needed to hear how I turned my humiliation into a victory. I thought about it for a long time. I didn't want to be a celebrity, but I did want to help other women who were trapped in marriages built on lies. I decided to accept the deal, but under one condition. I would write it anonymously at first. I didn't want the book to be about Patricia Woods. I wanted it to be about the truth. I titled the memoir For Your Connections. The writing process was hard. I had to relive every cold look and every forged signature. But as I finished the final chapter, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I signed the contract with a steady hand. Before we see the final visit, please hit subscribe for more stories of powerful justice. I was finally the author of my own life. Several months later, Marcus called me to say that Julian had been asking to see me. He was serving his sentence in a state prison 3 hours away. I didn't have to go, but I felt like I needed to see him one last time to close the circle. When I arrived, the room was cold and smelled like industrial cleaner. Julian walked in wearing a rough orange jumpsuit. He looked much smaller than I remembered. The expensive silk and the smug grin were completely gone. He looked like an old man who had lost everything. We sat in silence for a long time, looking at each other through the thick glass. "I loved you in my way, Patricia," he finally said. His voice was thin and raspy. I looked at him and didn't feel the anger I expected. I just felt a quiet, steady strength. "I preferred mine, Julian," I replied. I got up and walked away without looking back. I didn't need his apology to be whole. I received the first big payment for my book deal a month later. It was a staggering amount of money, more than I would ever need for myself. I sat at my desk and thought about the people Julian had hurt the most. I thought about the 6 elderly investors and the small charities whose funds had been stolen. I decided to donate a large part of my proceeds to rebuild every single organization his crimes had touched. I wrote personal letters to each group, explaining that the money was coming from a place of genuine care. I didn't want the foundation's name on the checks. I wanted my own name to stand for something new. I signed each donation letter with the same 2 words, "Signed, not yours." It was the final financial tie I had to cut. I was using the money earned from his betrayal to fix the holes he had dug. It was the most satisfying check I had ever signed in my life. A year had passed since the trial, and I was invited to speak at the Global Ethics Summit. The room was packed with world leaders and famous business owners. I stood on the stage, the same woman who had once stayed silent while her husband insulted her. I didn't talk about being a victim. I talked about power. I told the audience that some people are born into influence and some people try to steal it. Some men marry power because they think they can own it like a piece of property, I said into the microphone. But they forget one thing. Some women don't just hold power, they become it. The room stayed silent for a heartbeat, and then the entire audience rose for a standing ovation. I looked out at the sea of faces and felt a deep, inner warmth. I wasn't just my father's daughter or Julian's wife anymore. I was a force of my own. I had taken the very connections Julian tried to weaponize and turned them into a shield for the vulnerable. After the summit, I attended a small reception. A handsome new investor approached me, holding a glass of sparkling water. He was charming and had a smile that reminded me a little of Julian's old mask. He started talking about his new ventures and how much he admired my reach in the industry. "You must be very hard to impress, Patricia," he said, his voice dropping into a flirtatious tone. He leaned in closer, as if he expected me to be flattered by his attention. He was trying to see if I was still the woman who could be bought with a few sweet words. I looked him straight in the eye and gave him a small, knowing smile. "I'm not hard to impress," I told him calmly. "I'm just impossible to own." I walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing there alone. I knew how the game was played now, and I was no longer a player. I was the one who owned the board. My book was finally released. I had kept the secret for months, and it hit the shelves under a pseudonym. Within a week, it became a massive bestseller. Critics called it the most elegant revenge story of the decade. They praised the writing for being raw and honest. They didn't know it was my life, but they felt the truth in every word. Deep inside the prison library, Julian sat at a small wooden table and opened a copy. He read the first page, then the second. He saw the details of the gala, the secret bank accounts, and the final dinner. He realized as he read the descriptions of the cold husband that the world was laughing at him. He realized that I had turned his greatest betrayal into a masterpiece that would outlive his name. He sat in the silence of his cell, finally understanding that he hadn't just lost his freedom. He had lost the ability to tell his own story. I had taken that too. One quiet evening, I sat in my study and opened the digital file where I had started my revenge months ago. I scrolled back to the very first line I had written after that terrible night in the bedroom. He married me for my connections. I used them to disconnect him. It felt like a lifetime ago. I remembered the shaking hands and the cold fear I felt in the bathroom mirror. Now, my hands were steady and my heart was at peace. I realized that revenge wasn't just about winning a court case or seeing someone in prison. It was about reclaiming the space in your own head. I had spent so much time thinking about Julian, but now his face was starting to fade. I hit the delete key on the old evidence files. I didn't need them anymore. I closed the laptop and felt a final, perfect sense of closure. I was no longer a character in his drama. I was the hero of my own story. I stood on my balcony and looked out at the lights of Charleston. The city felt different to me now, not like a place where I had been hunted, but like a place I had helped heal. Julian spoke his truth that night, thinking I would break under the weight of his words. He thought I was a weak girl who needed his direction. But sometimes, the truth you try to use as a weapon becomes the very bullet that ends you. He married my power, thinking he could control it, and instead, he met it face to face. I am Patricia, and I am finally free. My father's foundation is safe, the investors are whole, and my soul is my own again. As the cool night air brushed against my face, I realized that the greatest connection I ever made wasn't with a billionaire or a politician. It was the connection I finally made with myself. He thought he married a connection, but he actually married a queen. And queens don't belong to anyone. If this story stayed with you, like the video, subscribe for more.